Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan at MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War update extra video, giving you extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. And we'll talk about another couple of sidebar topics tonight that aren't necessarily 100% to do with Ukraine War that will come out at the end. Anyway, thank you for watching on this International Day of Respect for Canada, which is why I'm wearing the retro top I am. Of course, we all know this day is here because Canada is awesome, right? Okay. Ilya Ponomarenko, who used to be a journalist for the Kyiv Independent. I don't know what he's doing at the moment. Anyway, he just has a little quite a long comment about the winter period for Ukraine. So he says, my own anticipation for the upcoming winter of war in Ukraine for the overall civilian population, it will be less difficult than the previous one. With the recent massive drone attacks, Russians probably made their first effort this cold season. With almost all of over 70 Shaheeds downed, one would say that was hardly a successful step. I talked about this the other day. I think they must have had issues with cruise missile firing, and there was talk about how the Russian Black Sea Fleet moving from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk on the eastern coast of the Black Sea has meant that the loading capabilities for cruise missiles onto those vessels and submarines and ships has been taken away. So they are unable to load their cruise missiles without having to sort something out. So that could be why we're not seeing cruise missiles used at the moment, although it doesn't particularly explain what's going on with the air-released missiles that they shoot from within Russia to the north. But nonetheless, they had that Shahed drone attack. I think they, if you were being sensible, the Russians would have flooded the skies with cruise missiles as well. But that they didn't, I think, speaks to the idea that they couldn't. That Shahed drone attack was really well coped with by the Ukrainian air defense systems, which is great news going, looking at what's going to happen over this period, over this autumn to winter period. But it's going to be super challenging nonetheless. We know that the Russians, pretty sure they've stockpiled an absolute ton of missiles, and arguably a whole bunch of Shahed missiles. There is this idea that they are able to build drones themselves now, even the Shahed drones. I don't know how far along that route they are. There are differing theories as to whether they can build the Shaheds or whether they are building a factory in order that they can build them. So I don't know, but I think the winter time will be difficult. This is what Ponomarenko says. And that following last year's failed campaign to deprive Ukraine of heating and electricity in winter, which started in as early as October the 10th, they would not waste the entire missile stockpile again, especially now that production is much more expensive and complicated due to the need to smuggle components worldwide, and given the last year's poor results that essentially had little to no effect on the Ukrainian military effort. Now, let's have a little think about that, because I think that the missile situation was bad for Russia, and they were using them at the rate they could fire them, or they're firing them, at the rate they could use them. And that meant that they weren't firing as many. We saw the stats drop off. And in fact, recently they fired hardly any. But I think they are stockpiling them, and that presents a problem because it's all about overwhelming the air defenses. So I wouldn't be quite so positive. I also think they're probably making more of them now than they were previously. So I think they've been able to get round sanctions. And I also am worried about their ability to procure ballistic missiles and perhaps other cruise missiles from Iran. These are all worries that leave me thinking, I'm slightly on edge about this winter period. But, ostensibly, Russia were unable to break Ukraine last year, and Ukraine did a fabulous job, all things considered, of rebuilding what was broken, of reacting really well, of doing the best they could with the air defenses they had. They have a far superior air defense network now, but, as I said previously, the Russians have the potential to release a much larger wave this year. So as the Ukrainians build up their air defense capabilities, the Russians have stockpiled missiles in order to match that new capability. Last year it was down there and it was kind of like that, and Russia overwhelmed the air defenses. So this is Russia, this is Ukraine. Russia overwhelmed the Ukrainian air defenses, but not by a large enough, not by a large enough margin for the Russians to cause the kind of crippling effects to the Ukrainian energy infrastructure they wanted. Now, as the year has gone on, the Russian ability to do that again has actually arguably, not improved for a long time. And in fact, their production against, what they were using, that they just couldn't produce the amount of missiles that would have seen them release missiles at the same rates as they had previously done. In other words, that period last year up to last winter, they were broadly using the huge stockpiles they had, right? But as those dwindled, they had to rely more and more on production. And that meant they were firing less and less. And as that was happening, the Ukrainian air defenses were being procured at a greater and greater quantity, so that now their air defenses are up here, but actually in not producing so many missiles, in not firing so many missiles, the Russians have actually built up a stockpile that puts them, I don't know where it puts them, actually. It's going to be interesting. Does it put them over the Ukrainian air defense threshold so that actually they properly had Shahed and cruise missile and ballistic missile waves, that they would overcome the air defenses to a much worse degree than last year? Or is the air defense system still able to cope with those waves? We don't know, because it hasn't been tested yet. So somewhere around here, that's kind of anywhere, sits the Russians. And that's why I'm on tentatives, because I just don't know. Will it sit here, and will the air defense systems be able to cope? Even, they are better than they've ever been in Ukraine. Will it match? Or will the Russians still be able to overcome that improved air defense due to stockpiling and procurement from Iran, and the ability to get their production up to better levels given loopholes with sanctions? Anyway, to carry on. Yet, if that balding scum of a human being, obsessed with his bruised ego and his megalomaniac thirst for power, says so and stamps his foot, the Russian military will be delivering new strikes with dozens of missiles every Monday, and F that voice of common reason. You should have seen and heard the night in January the 1st in Kiev when Russia launched dozens of Shaheds shortly after the midnight countdown, initiating a loud air battle over the sleepless city. Just imagine how petty and ridiculous one needs to be to do that just to spoil New Year's night for the people of Kiev. The missile winter 2022-23 was, quite frankly, one hell of a time. Power failures, rotating outages, mobile communications, internet connection troubles, and warming posts in communities nationwide. So they built these areas where you could go and get electricity, where you could get internet, where you could get warm, that were kind of like bunkers with power. For instance, my building in Bucha was more or less okay regarding the power supply, but the neighborhood in front of us was miserable sometimes. They were cold, dark days. There were cold, dark days when they had electricity for 4 or 5 hours a day with very long breaks. At some point, we even put forward an initiative to keep our apartment doors open for our neighbours to have a hot cup of tea or charge their gadgets and things like that. Solidarity rules. Many here in Ukraine, including yours truly, however, expected things to be much worse, down to spending at least weeks in the 19th century. Nevertheless, thanks to our air defence and our grid repairers, Russia failed, as you know. Even on the most difficult days around Christmas time, life and economic activities were never genuinely paralysed. Restaurants, bars, hotels, offices, supermarkets, gyms, gas stations, even the smallest coffee shops and shawarma kiosks, everything was generally working, either adapting to hours without electricity, who said you can't work or have fun with friends by candlelight for 4 hours, or invested in purchasing power generators or batteries or power stations. Modern technology makes going through things of such a kind as easy as never before. Last year, if you were lucky to have a good EcoFlow station and LED lights at home, you were generally quite okay with daily power outages. The problem, however, was that such energy equipment was either very expensive or hard to get due to extreme demand, or both. This year it's not cheap, but still it's much more affordable than during the missile winter. So many people will buy something from themselves to outlast yet another winter of Russia's aspiration towards peace with Ukraine. Either way, we all now have the experience, and everyone knows that he or she can do to make things easier in wartime winter. Not a new thing for us. And of course, businesses, large and small, here and there in Kiev and beyond, one can already see large shopping malls or business centres rolling out and installing really huge power stations on their parking lots. They're also preparing to continue working as planned no matter what. Last winter, basically all large supermarket chains, for instance, would let anyone come and charge gadgets at their premises. The situation was not that critical, so not too many people adhered to that, but this was and is a good thing, of course. And, of course, thanks to Western aid, Ukraine's air defence is right now as strong as never before. I've even take the courage to state that Ukraine, particularly Kiev, is among the best defended places in the world. I would argue that must be the case as well. Even in the States, you're not going to have that kind of coverage across all the cities in America. Of course you won't. So even if you took, I guess, Washington, but maybe New York, one of those two cities, I wonder how well defended that is compared to Kiev. I'm sure it is, but Kiev's going to be up there. If you think Washington's probably the second best defended city, or no, probably the best defended city in the world, arguably, I don't know. It'd be interesting because so many of those capabilities are kept secret. You don't quite know where things are and how well prepared they are. Nevertheless, it would be interesting to see that kind of top 10 list, wouldn't it? So let's see what's coming our way. I think it's going to be okay. Either way, we have no choice other than to live on, fight on, and support our military. We don't have another homeland to live in. Interesting words from Ponomarenko there, and worth thinking about a little bit there, and especially with kind of what we think they might be in store for, considering what Russia may or may not have. Okay, Mick Ryan, a retired Australian general, says the first snows and rains, the winding down of Ukrainian offensive operations, but not cessation, and this surge in Russian air and missile attacks highlights a change in the phase of the Ukraine war. The war has now shifted into the winter 2023-24 campaign. The war is at a very different point to where it was at the beginning of winter last year. What are the key differences in the war as we enter the winter of 2023 compared to this time last year? Well, first, Russia entered winter last year reeling from their defeats in Kharkiv and Kherson. Under the overall commander General Surovikin, the Russian forces shifted to a defensive strategy in order to preserve their remaining combat forces while absorbing mobilized troops. This was abruptly upended halfway through the winter when General Gerasimov was appointed overall commander and shifted onto the offensive very quickly. This year, there will be continuity in the overall leadership of Russia's invading forces. Second, Ukraine has a greatly expanded operational and strategic strike capacity. Since 2022, Ukraine has continued to improve its capacity to undertake operational and strategic strike campaigns. Unlike last year, Ukraine has a much improved ability to respond to Russian strikes against civilian infrastructure while also degrading Russian operational enablers, logistics, reserves, HQ in occupied Ukraine. Third, Ukraine has continued to enhance its air, missile and drone defensive network. The Ukrainian Air Defense Network has received additional Western air defense systems since last year, and therefore the defense of some Ukrainian cities over winter will be enhanced. I mean, as the picture shows there, you've got your kind of, I guess, your lowest grade air defenses, which are heavy machine guns on the back of an SUV. That looks like a slightly better proper air defense system on the back of there, an anti-air gun. So that's going to be an SPAAG, self-prepared anti-air gun. You're going to have your Gepards. It's like your next step up. Well, actually, your lowest step is small arms fire. Teams with small arms fire going around shooting. We've even heard drones being shot down by small arms fire. Then you got your heavy machine guns on the back of SUVs and whatnot. And then you've got your actual anti-aircraft guns loaded on to SUVs or trucks or whatever, different platforms, or maybe even stationary platforms. And then you've got things like your Gepards. That's a slight step up. And then you've got your MAN-PADs. So your man portable air defense systems like your Stingers, your Starstreak, your Iglas, all these different ones from around the world. And then you have your systems set on vehicle chassis like the Avenger, which is 8 of those on the back of a Humvee. 8 Stingers, I think 2 pods of 4. You've got your Stormers, which is the UK's kind of equivalent, using Starstreak instead of Stingers, so on and so forth. So you're going up, and then you have other sort of short to medium. You've got Hawk air defense systems that are older, more obsolete, but been upgraded, and they are being used. And you're going on to things like Iris-T, which have a short range and a medium range, NASAMS, SAMP-T, Patriot. There's your top end, your Patriots, PAC-3, and your SAMP-T, although it depends what you're trying to aim at as to what kind of variant of the Patriot you might prefer. You've got that whole range, and all those missile systems in between that I haven't even mentioned. They've just got a whole range of these things. You've got your Soviet era, your Books and your OSAs and your S-300s, all of those, all in there. And they've just got a whole range of these that are then joined together by a central command system that joins them all together, including, I believe now, the Soviet era ones, so they can plug everything in and see some threats and say, right, okay, that threat is over there, and you're going to use this to shoot that down. That threat's over there, and it can even do that to a degree in an automated way. Anyway, so they're just in a lot better position than they were. Okay, so it's enhanced these situations. The Ukrainian Air Defense Network has received additional Western air defense systems since last year, and therefore defense of some Ukrainian cities over winter will be enhanced. Notwithstanding these upgrades, it is not possible to defend every potential target. I mean, Ukraine's huge. We should expect that Russia will exploit any gaps in air defense coverage to place pressure on the Ukrainian government and to make life as hard as possible for the Ukrainian people. That's why they've been sending over these odd kind of single or small waves of Shaheeds or missiles, like trying to work out where the systems are. I believe that you can even see, so there's satellite imagery of like Patriot systems that you can see that I'm sure I saw recently. So they're going to know where most of these are, but even knowing where they are doesn't always help, because you still have to hit them, and to hit them you need to get through them. So if you've got Patriot and all these other systems in place, you might know where they are, but you can't blow them up because they are air defense systems. Fourth is a level of optimism in Western capitals about the war. In November to December 2022, the great tank debate was winding down. There was a triumphant Zelensky visit to Washington, D.C. just before Christmas, and optimism about Ukraine's expected offensives in the spring of 2023. Much of that optimism has now dissipated in the wake of the Ukrainian southern offensive. Ukraine has inflicted significant attrition on the Russians, but in the long term, unless Western aid significantly increases, the Russians are better placed to absorb such attrition. This goes back to what I was talking about this morning. Are the rates, there? I think they are there at the moment, but the Ukrainians will need continued large amounts of Western aid to sustain the attritional rates and to sustain their own, rates of losses. I talk about, it would be great if they can sustain a 5-to-1 Russian to Ukrainian loss ratio in terms of the key bits of equipment. That's what they need. So when you have days where it's like 2 or 3 times the Russians are losing 2 or 3 times what the Ukrainians are losing, that's still not good. I mean, that's terrible for the Russians, but it's still not good enough for the Ukrainians. They really need to have that asymmetry of attritional rates to bleed out a win here for them, short of any other massive gains in terms of, well, indeed, that will precipitate gains in territory. So anyway, to continue, the recent Time article on President Zelensky and article in The Economist, where General Zaluzhny mentioned the heretofore avoided stalemate word, have contributed to this mood of strategic gloominess going into winter 2023. Fifth, the Ukrainian armed forces at the end of 2023 is a very different institution from that which existed in 2022. While many of the senior leaders may be the same, the experiences of late 2022 and throughout 23 have led to a larger and different military institution. It has evolved its thinking on modern warfare, including the balance of crewed and uncrewed systems, continued to transition to a NATO-style institution, increased use of electronic warfare, changed doctrine, and the systemic learning of lessons and improved training regime. So there's a lot to be said about how the Ukrainians have adapted and evolved over the war. you can say the same of the Russians, of course. It's not like they aren't evolving themselves as well. Like all large, intense and long wars, institutions that fight them evolve significantly as the war progresses. The Ukrainian armed forces that exist now have the old single plural issues here, right? Because I used forces, right? The Ukraine armed force that exists now has changed in how they develop and employ the physical, moral, and intellectual aspects of fighting power compared to February 2022. Finally, there is now another war that is drawing on the time of Western leaders and strategists, as well as the warfighting material needed by Ukraine. Unfortunately, this has moved Ukraine off the front page and has had an effect on support for the war among Western citizens. Unfortunately, the Russians have also learned and adapted over the past year. As I said earlier, they remain a large, capable and deadly enemy for the Ukrainians. Therefore, the winter campaigns in Ukraine this year will share some continuity from last year, but also feature many different political, strategic and tactical elements. Both sides still jab at each other, but there is little prospect of decisive changes. And then he said he points people towards his Substack for further details on that. So interesting little analysis there from Mick Ryan. And actually there's another very short thread where he dips into this, and I almost shared this with you the other day, but I didn't get round to finding Google translations of this. I mean, I could do it through Google Lens, but I haven't done it. So a useful update from Sam Bendit on Russian adaptation. So talking about Russian adaptation of its protection systems for vehicles in Ukraine. The drone protection cages are also being used by the Ukrainians and Israelis in Gaza, and he goes on to show that. So these are the different systems being used. So the kind of cope cages on over the bonnets or over the top of the vehicles, and then over the back of the vehicles as well, if they are trucks, or MRAPs or whatever, carrying personnel or equipment. And then we see other forms of canopies and cages around the side. These are quite similar to what the British Huskies and similar vehicles that were used in Afghanistan recently, that the Ukrainians have a bunch of. They have cages around them to stop RPGs particularly, but now that is very useful they are very useful for drones. And here we have on tanks different sort of cope cages and canopies that at the beginning of the war, as I said before, were correctly ridiculed because they were trying to stop javelins with these. They were designed to stop RPGs. They're never going to stop a top-down attack from a javelin. And so people took the mickey out of these, but now they are useful because their main raison d'etre is to defend from drones that don't have the ability to penetrate armor like javelin. So these cope cages can actually be useful against IED dropping drones and also one-way loitering munition. Okay, while counter-drone systems lag development of drones before the war, there is now a vigorous and ongoing adaptation battle between drones and anti-drone systems in Ukraine and elsewhere. This is that kind of arms race where you get a weapon, then the countermeasure, and then the weapon has to overcome the countermeasure. So the countermeasure then has to catch up and have a countermeasure, and it goes like this onwards and upwards. And that's the same with kind of electronic warfare. That's the same with defending against these kinds of weapons. Right. The Ukrainians are using larger cages for the protection of artillery from drones. Of course, the trade-off here is that it can make artillery less mobile and more liable to be discovered. Obviously, it's not so camouflaged by the Russian ISR complex. And Israel, the Israelis are using similar anti-drone cages on some of their armoured vehicles in Gaza. It will be interesting to see their lessons on Hamas drone employment and lethality at some point. This counter-drone adaptation battle is only just starting because at the moment it is largely about aerial drones. The continuing expansion of autonomous systems, lethal and non-lethal, into the sea and ground domains, which we have seen in real time happen. We are starting to see UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles. We've seen USVs, unmanned sea vehicles, being used effectively in Sevastopol and out in the Black Sea. But they are being used in different contexts now and in different ways. So there's the idea that you've got torpedo drones coming online that should be able to be sent out to basically say the harbour at Sevastopol wait in the water because it can't get in because they put all the protections in there. But as soon as the ship comes out, then it activates and then goes and hits. Those kind of capabilities are there. We're yet to see them utilised, at least as far as we understand. But I'm sure they're waiting to be used. And the same with ground vehicles. We're starting to see drones, UGVs drop mines off, drag injured people away. Do a number of different things. We've seen not drones, but automated machine gun systems being used in the south of Avdiivka by Ukraine. These systems being used, in the sea and on the ground domains will supercharge this adaptation process. So there you go, some interesting bits and pieces there. We're going to move on to a slightly different topic now. The first thing, because this comes up so often, I just want to talk about it very explicitly. So someone here says, hey, mate, you best leave your political insights to your own backyard, as you're not particularly knowledgeable on the issues that impact politics in the USA. Maybe fair enough. I get this an awful lot where people are saying, stick to the Ukraine war, don't talk politics. It's like, this is a geopolitical channel. Like, I'm going to talk politics. And what you find is that people say, I don't know what I'm talking about, usually if I just have an opinion that's different to theirs. And politics is so divisive that if I'm going to say some kind of lefty liberal thing and someone's sitting on the right, which many of you are, right? But most of you who know me well will just go, okay, here goes, or we'll have a discussion about it, or you'll disagree, but we'll do it amicably. But some people are like, because I disagree, and it's cognitive dissonance reduction, to give you the proper term for it, and I've talked about this before, it's when you have a core belief in your head and you have evidence against that belief, that disharmony can't exist. So your brain does things to keep your core belief. You very rarely change your mind based on new evidence. It does happen, but it's a difficult process. Usually you keep your core belief. So what do you do with that new evidence that's coming along? Well, one of the common ways to reduce that cognitive dissonance is to shoot the messenger. Essentially, is you ridicule the messenger or other things like that. So you don't know what you're talking about, and it means you don't have to deal with the evidence. I don't have to deal with his political opinions and the substance of what he says. I'm just going to dismiss him as a human. And so there you go, it disappears. I keep my core belief, right? So that is what's going on here, rather than say, oh, here's something that disagrees with my core belief. And hopefully the rational thinker, the open-minded thinker goes, okay, how do I deal with that? So I've got this belief, you've got that belief. At least one of us is wrong. We could both be wrong, right? But at least one of us is wrong. Could that be me? If it's not me, it's you, but I need to show you that you're wrong. So what are my arguments against your position? That's what hopefully I want to happen here. So if you disagree with my political opinions, tell me why they're wrong. Don't just go, you are wrong, you don't know what you're talking about, go away. Okay, well, it's my channel, and it's a geopolitical channel, so if I can't talk about politics, then I don't know, what's the point? So I just wanted to explicitly talk about that. I have written a lot on politics. I'm employed partly as a political journalist. It's not a major gig I have. I do 2 articles a week. But, my last article was a huge one on politics in Europe pertaining to Putin. And I've written hugely on American politics. In fact, most of my political writing is on American politics. I think what underwrites this is I just mentioned the Second Amendment and gun control. And I know it's going to get people's hackles up. And I had people saying, you don't understand the Second Amendment. I do understand the Second Amendment a lot. I'm not going to go off on one about the Second Amendment, but if you ever want to go to Only Sky and check out, if you just put in Second Amendment, I can bet you I've written most of the articles at the top of this list. One by me, Second Amendment and rights on gun control and Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is gun control regulation. Those are all mine. And so on and so forth. Anyway, you get the idea. A bunch of those are mine. Second Amendment, gun rights, but what is a right and do we have them? So that would be... So what's interesting, I wrote most of these articles before Only Sky existed. It's a relatively new media company. And a load of us writers came over from another place where we were cancelled. We were basically cancelled. I've lost 2 jobs I've lost 2 jobs by being cancelled, by the way. So if you ever say, oh, the left wing always cancels the right, I've been cancelled twice by the right, and I've lost 2 jobs. I can't talk about them for legal reasons, but I can very strongly tell you from my own personal opinion that the right has a predilection to cancel the left as much as you might think the left does to the right. But there you go. So anyway, but what's interesting is when I wrote these things on the Second Amendment, I had the most comments I've ever had on any. So I had like over 2,000 comments on these articles. Now, unfortunately, as these were migrated from the other site, the comments were left, and it's such a shame. There's amazing and some pretty virulent comments as well. But nothing annoys people more. Like I'm a writer on religion, right? And I'm an atheist, and you think, well, religion and politics, these are the 2 most divisive subjects, and people get really angry, and they do, right? I've had many a debate about religion, of course, and I've had many a debate about politics, of course, but nothing compares to when you talk about gun control. Thousands of comments, and what you do is you have people on gun rights advocacy websites. They come as like a whole group of people. They're like, we've got an article over here, and they get all their mates, and they all come over, and they like bombard, and it becomes this huge, massive argument. What my arguments seek to do is look at the philosophy behind the Constitution. And what rights are. Like, forget like these are about guns. Well, like, what is a human right? And actually, it's like human rights don't exist. They don't exist out there. We don't find them. We don't like come across them. Oh, there's a human right. Let's adopt that. What we do is we construct them. And something like the Constitution is a set of what a bunch of people, just a bunch of people in history, thought were a good set of rights. They wrote them down, and in fact, they weren't so great at the beginning that they had to add a bunch of amendments. So these amendments are then added to the Constitution, and they can be amended out of the Constitution as well. It just takes kind of super majorities and whatnot. But, you can change that document. So a lot of people think that's set in stone and it's inalienable rights. But of course, there's no such thing as an inalienable right? It just doesn't exist. And now I do a lot of looking at the philosophy, what's called the ontology, the existence of abstract ideas like rights. Like, where do rights exist? And my argument would be that we construct them, and they meaningfully exist when we write things like a constitution, but it's just a piece of paper. So that's fairly meaningless until you enact them into law, and the key part of that is enforce that too. So rights are only meaningful if they are enacted and enforced. How do you enact them? Well, you usually you have some kind of democratic process where you are voting someone into power who you agree with, and you are sure that you hope they are going to pass legislation that is in accordance with your moral beliefs and enact your ideas of rights into law. And then you get hopefully the country has some kind of force that enforces, like a police force, jurisprudence and whatnot, that enacts and that enforces those laws. So that's when they become meaningful. But talking about I have this inalienable right to bear arms is like, to me, it's just like, well, you don't really. Actually, you have that right in your country if it's enacted and enforced, but it's not objective truth. And you can talk about what is the right to self-defense. What is a human right? It's an abstract idea. If we were to all die, if all sentient creatures were to die, there would be no rights. They don't exist out there. They exist in here. And when we agree on them, we write dictionaries and encyclopedias and legal codes. But you can look around the world and you've got a whole set of different legal codes. And over time, whole set of different legal codes. Who's right? Which ones are right? Well, you have to do philosophy to do that. We have to construct rationale that will argue certain rights over the other. What happens when one right contravenes another? What about my right not to be shot at by someone with a gun in my street? So, how do we deal with rights that contradict each other or come into conflict with each other? Which ones have hierarchical precedence over others? Well, of course, there is no objective truth to that. So again, we have to just sit down and argue to toss over it. Anyway, I just thought I'd share some of these ideas with you, stuff I've talked about previously with you. If you want to know about cancel culture, you can go to my Atypical Philosopher YouTube channel. I have debated US presidential nominee David French. Really nice guy, actually. He's staunchly religious conservative, but really nice with it. He's just not, but really, he's a really nice guy, and he's actually really good at reaching across the aisle and having these kind of conversations. We talked about cancel culture on a radio show that they've allowed me to put onto my own website, which is why it's only got 300 views. On their one, it's got many more than that. But anyway, if you want to watch that, go onto Atypical and Philosopher and look for that debate if you're interested in stuff like cancel culture. And actually, what's quite connected to what I've just been talking about, which I think is pretty interesting. And this one raises its ugly head. Every time I talk about democracy, I get people in the threads saying, the US isn't a democracy, it's a republic. Like here, America is not a democracy, we are a constitutional republic. And then, lots of talk about that. So let's just very quickly talk about that, because I want to put that to bed. So what is a democracy? The belief in freedom and equality between people, or a system of government based on this belief in which power is either held by elected representatives or directly by the people themselves. Is the US a democracy? Yes, I think it falls under that. It is a system of elected representatives. Is it a republic? A republic, a country without a king or queen, usually governed by elected representatives of the people and a president. Well, yes, it's a republic by that definition. So it's not a democracy, it's a republic. And it's a republic and not a democracy. It is both. And in fact, this article basically says this perfectly. Is the US a democracy or a republic? We often hear a question debated in person and online by Americans who care deeply about making sure our government works for the people. Is the United States a democracy or a republic? Here's the answer. The United States is both a democracy and a republic. We promise we're not dodging the question. It would be much easier if one word was absolutely correct and the other was not, but the terms are not mutually exclusive. In fact, it's a nested hierarchy. The United States can be accurately defined as both a democracy and a republic. Let's break down why. Is the United States a democracy? Yes, it's a democracy since we, the people, hold the ultimate political power. We're not a direct democracy, but we are a representative democracy, which is similar to the UK. Although there are mechanistic differences, it's the same kind of principle. This is where our history education might add some confusion. We are commonly taught that democracy is a product of ancient Greece. It's their word demokratia. After all, the city-state of Athens is credited with implementing a system of government of and by the people, whereby eligible citizens would congregate to make decisions, then make these decisions themselves or directly, not through any elected representatives. And that's the key difference. That system of government, better understood today as direct democracy, lives on in the United States in the form of ballot initiatives and referenda. Some states and localities afford their citizens the right of use of these measures to directly enact, change or report laws themselves. So there are areas in the US where there is this direct democracy. But actually the main political system is, well, more commonly it says we exercise our political power in a different way by voting in elections to choose our representatives. That's a representative democracy. So it's not me changing the laws and doing stuff, but I vote for someone who does that by representing me in Parliament, right? Or in Congress or wherever. So the Constitution does not use the term democracy. It's true. But as Eugene Volokh notes in the Washington Post, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Noah Webster, Justice James Wilson, and Chief Justice John Marshall all used the word. So founding fathers used the word. These scholars understood representative democracy, the American variety, to be democracy all the same. Is the US a republic? Yes, the US is a republic because our elected representatives exercise political power. History also tells us that Rome was a republic, unlike Athens. When its monarchy was overthrown, Rome developed a republican system of government whereby citizens elected officials that were empowered to make decisions for the public. That's the core of how our government works. While democracy and republic have been historically pitted against one another, the reality is the two terms enjoy considerable overlap. So which term should I use? It's really up to you. In practice, the word republic has the same meaning as the term representative democracy. And a representative democracy is a form of democracy, nested hierarchies, in the same way that a Granny Smith apple is a form of apple. We shouldn't say it's inaccurate to use apple to describe a Granny Smith apple, so it's okay to follow in the footsteps of Jefferson, Adams, Webster, and Chief Justice Marshall and simply call our representative democracy a democracy. But it's also accurate to call the US a republic. It's mostly about your preference of words. Hopefully this post will help lower the heat in the online debate. Let's put our energy towards working to fix our government so it represents the people. And then you can actually be even more accurate to say it's a federal constitutional representative democracy. It's just ways of defining what type of democracy it is. But it is a democracy. It is a republic. It's not one or the other. So this has come up so many times in the thread, or a bunch of times in the thread, where whenever I mention democracy, it's like, and I usually know where those people are coming from as well. I don't want to get into those long weeds. Certain type of people will call out that it's not a democracy. I don't know why you would want to do that particularly, other than to, make some kind of political signalling point of who you are and where you sit. Anyway, I thought that might or might not be of interest to you. Let me know. I have viewers from all around the world, right? And some of you don't give a toss about the US, and some of you will care but don't know enough about how it works, and some of you in the US might not even have a grasp on some of these terms. So I think it's useful to do that. I didn't want to talk about the Second Amendment for obvious reasons, that half of you will go like a big gun exploding in a public place, and half of you will go, yeah, I totally agree with you, and then we'll have a big fight, online, virtual. So I didn't want to do that, but I have talked a lot about the philosophy behind that in previous talks about morality and trying to establish how we do morality. And it's the same kind of thinking, because human rights are to do with morality. So you're talking about gun control, which is politics, but it's also morality. Should we? And anytime you say should we do something, it's morality. So anyone that talks about the Second Amendment and gun control and gun rights is talking about morality. You need to establish your moral framework first. And also, if you're talking about the Constitution, you need to establish the philosophical basis of the Constitution. And how do you justify those claims in the Constitution? How do you understand that they are different in that country and different in there, or different in time? So at one point they didn't have that amendment, and one point they did. And how do you know now is a perfect iteration of the Constitution, and so on and so forth. And we could go on along those lines, but hopefully this was of interest. It may not be. Thank you so much for your support. Please like, subscribe and share. Speak to you again, and hopefully not on such divisive topics. Look, if you disagree with what I say, just be nice about it. Let's get along, guys. Let's try and reach across the aisle and come to some mutual understanding of how the universe works.